Welcome back to the With Joe Eby podcast, continuing with the Harry Potter series. Today we're going to dive into a little bit the kind of contrast between love and ego, really, or narcissism. That's really big in the books and in the movies. And obviously the disclaimer is always that there are kind of spoilers. So if you're yet to read the books or need a rehash, this is your official warning. Again, to remind you, the inspiration behind this little series is that having reread the books as an older person, and there's so much in there that I think is really, I think pretty much like every human, every life, every single person's individual struggles, setbacks, any challenges you have to having a fulfilling life, they boil down to fundamental things that we all face. And I think we've had so many attempts from different parts of the world, like art, philosophy, and religion, and more, to try and help us navigate, address big questions, answers. And I think this is actually a very comprehensive, as we'll talk about today, this big, the kind of two ends of the spectrum, almost, in terms of narcissism and love. I think J.K. Rowling in the books does a really good job putting it in a very digestible way. There, under the smoothness of a story, the Trojan horse of a story, to help unpack something that's really deep. So at the end, I'll jump to the end of the kind of fifth book, where there's like the kind of prophecy revealed about how to bring down Voldemort. And there's a line in that prophecy which is, neither can live while the other survives. And that refers to Harry and Voldemort, that those two characters can't, one of them will have to kill the other. Well, that's how it's presented. And the way I read that, one of my understandings of Voldemort when I looked at the books last year is that he is the pure embodiment of a person totally run by their ego, totally overcome by narcissism. So to recap a little bit, because it's a word that gets used many different ways, you all have, every single person has an ego, and yet no one really has an ego. As Alan Watts said, this is a concept, this is a construct, it's a word we use to describe tendencies we have, but we all have them. It's not the same as being arrogant. It's I guess it's the voice in the story. I understand it now as the voice and story in your head about who you are that you form in an attempt to try and make sense of yourself in the world. And so in that way, in that we all are born, we all have some sort of story about who we are in the world, and we're always forming that story and trying to fuel or further that story. It is kind of unavoidable. Kind of, but we can explore that a bit in this episode too. And so I just want to give the context of, the ego. It's very much associated with the story of your identity very often, so it's not necessarily bad. That story you have about who you are, right? That story you tell yourself. It's not all bad. And so it's just a consequence that seems to arise. There's nothing to fear. And anyway, but, there's one thing about when you feed into that too much, right? So I think, to me, the Harry Potter and Voldemort contrast is representing the underlying thing within people, right? Because Harry, of course, the whole series is this tension because Harry is showing Voldemort like tendencies in some way, and he's afraid that he's going that way. Excuse me. Whoops. Anyway, yeah, so that story about who you are, and that Voldemort seems to be like one contrast about when you feed it and let it go amok, and Harry seems to be the opposite, as if anyone knows how the story goes. I might backpedal a bit. We were talking in the previous episode about how maybe as a consequence of the ego, maybe as the consequence of these things about us we don't understand, we seem to have even for people who are not invested in religion or the concept of religion and beliefs about afterlife, or actively asking questions about life. Sometimes we think we've overcome those things. Not that they're bad in and of themselves. We can use them in bad ways. Sometimes we overcome, like, you might think of yourself as a religious person, but the way you behave and pursue things in your life might represent the way a lot of people interact with religions. So something in your life can often become a salvation. And I don't know if this point was made clear in previous episodes, but I want to get back to it, is the idea of addiction. Addiction for me is one of the core things underlying human experience, this spectrum of not letting objects, making objects serve us, making things in life serve us in a healthy way, versus when we start to serve them, when it spins, when we start to worship almost objects and things, the image we have of other people, our blurred perspective of other people. We start to create a false perspective of things like alcohol, like sex, money, people who have status, people who are successful, people who give us the answers, teachers, priests. It could be anything, right? And we almost seem to worship them, right? They seem to become the be all and end all. And sometimes that's what an addiction looks like, An addiction, to me, always looks like a new promise of, it makes sense initially, but immortality. Like it's like a fix, it's like a solution, it's like a lifeline. You know what I mean? Like, you have life as long as you need it. I don't know if you've ever felt addicted to something, but the common experience is that if you're really hooked on something, right? Say alcohol, nothing else in your life really gives you as much relief or satisfaction or escape as alcohol. And you think about it all the time, and your mind has just been so suckered into, and so alcohol is the lifeline. Alcohol is the salvation. It's just an interpretation. And so that addiction just gets stronger because you're like, I need it, and you're feeding that thought that you need something, or that it's, the be all and end all. And because, Voldemort, again, is pursuing immortality, essentially endless power and immortality he wants never to be conquered, and that's it. It's like, never be conquered, and then what? Main rule over it. So it's just a power for power's sake thing. And yeah, I guess the thing about, addiction is that you feed them enough, they can overpower you. And if you have enough pain to start with, though, that creates your risk of exposure to an addiction. So people, the stereotypical, like, drug addict, heroin addict, whatever, has suffered a lot of pain. You know what I mean? There's a lot of abuse, trauma, bad childhood. We have the other cliche of, girls with daddy issues, or hedonistic guys with mummy issues. Those are where the seeds are sown. There's a pain there, and we're kind of self-medicating with addictions as a coping relief strategy rather than a solving solution thing. And this is obviously, all these things have the ability to permanently taint our life if we just are subsumed by the addiction. We start to worship this thing. Anyone can go out and have a drink, 1 drink, 2 drinks, 5, 6 drinks, and probably it's not the end of the world. The object hopefully serves them. Social lubricant, bit of an edge, nice taste, whatever. The opposite can happen when you start serving it in a way, you start to worship it. And I think why I'm bringing that up is that's an important dynamic in human behavior, because one of the conditions of this grappling with the idea that you exist, this ego battle and story that you grapple with all your life, is that you the pain incurred by that story is to me where the psychological existential pain you carry around, and often has a big relationship with physical illness too. Right? So let's walk with the example of, someone who had a very rough, abusive childhood or something like that, and walking around with this pain and this feeling of, this happened to me. And there's all these reasons and stories people form around why the bad thing happen, and therefore all these ideas they have about themselves might form an inferiority complex, right? It might feel like this happened to me because I'm bad, I'm worse than everyone else. And so another consequence of that, one of the ways this can go is then developing a superiority complex, right? To try and compensate for the internal inferiority complex, the exterior is something we swell up. We need to make that exterior person out in the world big and try and feed but the ego is locked in on this idea of inferiority. So the idea of getting the world to say that you are and reflect back that you're superior is a constant, effortful, draining exercise. Because internally it's not believed. It's just a constant, it's like having someone walk with you everywhere to remind you how great you are. And with them going away, you've lost it. So you will always need someone. And so you see how people will start to use other people as tools. So I don't know any Voldemorts personally, but it's a spectrum. And we all luckily, I think, tend to do the Voldemort-like thing, pursue ideas of where we, pursue power in small forms, try to control the future a bit, try and influence it, try and figure out the answers, try and beat death, or one of the ways of beating death anyway. So that's a lovely little idea tour maybe, coined a word there. That just gives some fundamentals to what the path of ego and love is, why they diverge. So the ego thing, to me, really, if you look at Voldemort, where it's either the first or second episode in this series where we talked about Voldemort, how terrible his upbringing was, how his childhood, feeling abandoned, having no sense of self, creates this void through which the story, as a reaction, the story in your head tries to fill that void with a meaning, instead of just acknowledging that it's not his fault. And so if you do begin to feel bad for Voldemort, that's probably a good and interesting place to be. And that's the power of the writing, or the concepts at least. Because this is a question: what terrible figure from history or your own life ever did anything that didn't have a seed of, didn't come from a seat of pain, or a sense of inadequacy, or insecurity? No, it doesn't justify it, but knowing that's where it comes from, and there's not just this inherent all-out badness about people, I think is valuable. I think it's true. In children's books like the Harry Potter thing, and most movies, the baddies are very one-dimensional. They don't tend to have redeeming qualities. But when you encounter narcissism and people who've just been sucked into feeding that story of importance instead of leaning into a more kind of peaceful, loving life, they do tend to have redeeming qualities, You don't see it all the time. And so that's the more realistic day-to-day encounter. But what Harry Potter, I think, paints is the two extremes. Kind of a Dumbledore-ish path and a Voldemort-ish path. And they're just paths, really. They're not absolutes. They're paths. So now, on that layer, you can start bringing in something like Christianity. I don't know where you're Christian. I'm not here to advertise Christianity to you. To explore it. What is it trying to do? What is its attempt? And that's we talked about the previous episode, there's two different ways they go about immortality. Dumbledore very much has this ensuing immortality that's not physical. It's much more this legacy and impact that comes from him, from a place of beauty. Voldemort is pursuing immortality from physical, like literally controlling his life beyond the natural control of a human life. They're almost both godlike in a way, but in the opposite type of godlike. So Voldemort is very much like the devil in Christianity, and Dumbledore's like the a very godlike kind of thing, very overseeing character, very watchful, intervenes only when necessary, otherwise lets you go and figure it out for yourself. We'll talk more about that approach in another episode. So when I see the concept of temptation, in the Bible, again, not that you must look at things through a religious lens, but taking the value from these things as ways of looking at it. It's the pitfalls of the ego. That's what the devil is, temptation. Because we're constantly tempted by ways of trying to numb our pain. Ways of trying to satisfy that story. We're always tempted. Someone gives you an opportunity to get some sort of power in the world. Maybe it's more money. Maybe I think of a very subtle example. I have a friend who, is older, has had the bulk of her career. She talked about the job changes she regretted were the ones that were just a level up for the sake of going a level up, but not work she actually enjoyed. Why is it tempting? Because it's going up. It's more prestige and all that, but the role itself was not actually attractive. It's hardly an act of evil, but you go against yourself. But temptation is not temptation towards what's better. It's what appears to be better, but is a temptation to go against yourself. Because of the ego squared nature of how we interact with each other in the world. If other people are hooked onto the that stuff, they promote it to others. We need the ego is a force that needs validation, external validation. If that's what we're feeding, right? I've never met someone who's addicted to peace and quiet on their own. It doesn't have an addictive quality. It always requires you interacting and, consuming, pretty much. Consuming or manipulating and controlling. Again, something that you see heavily embedded into Voldemort's character in the Harry Potter series. And, and so to jump around a bit, there's another quote from the first book, Philosopher's Stone, when Voldemort has his first ever encounter with Harry in the books. And he's giving us a window into his worldview and trying to impress it upon Harry. He says, there is no good and evil, so he overcomes that distinction. He says, there is only power and those too weak to seek it. And this is, I think, a very powerful thing, very powerful idea, again. This is the idea of how an egomaniac sees the world. So how someone who is so overcome with needing to validate their sense of importance, again, probably because of internal hurt. This internal hurt, this is essentially like the devil and the ego in the devil in Christianity. And it's not so much that, how do we justify doing bad things in the pursuit of power? Well, we stop seeing it as, it's almost the script of natural selection in a way, in a very twisted way. And even like a form of rampant kind of capitalism. Not that I want to start bringing isms too much into this. Simple language, Joe. But the idea that what's just not strong enough to survive is just weak, not bad. Therefore, that's what's going to die off. And therefore, that's what you can kill. You're not as good as me. Right? There is no good and evil. So taking away the concept of a good and evil, it'd be nice if Voldemort did that in a kind of non-judgment way, like in not judging everything in terms of good and evil, but just, living peacefully. Kind of does it in a self-serving way, it seems. But good luck to him. He's entitled to his opinion. And it's kind of like you suspect that some of the figures from history that you don't like, or maybe even modern times, who've sort of participated in genocide and stuff like that, you start to get the idea that they looked at the people they've done terrible things to or killed in that way. That they're weak. Therefore, that's just the way it is. And that's what the Muggles are in the to Voldemort and his followers, I think, in the Harry Potter thing. They're just in his story of the world, they are inferior. Because they're not as strong, they're not as powerful, not as magical. So therefore, they're a primitive version of the species. The same idea as in X-Men. the same idea between the mutants and the Homo sapiens, or same ideas for a lot of us between, class systems. It's between us and the animals. The beauty of I guess a story is that you can look at it and see it on any level of our lives. But when you take away that concept, when you look at the world in terms of this one currency of power, it is a removal of a lot of the ethical and moral kind of safety measures that are in the human condition. And it allows us all sorts of justifications. It's and in the business world, what's not the business that doesn't succeed, dies, and that's the way it is. And that's a capitalism idea. And I guess it's the way it should be in the business world. But this is the kind of sort of force. This is like where we get the idea in business that if this helps me win, if this helps me make more money, if this helps my career, how can it be bad when the right or wrong get diluted? Because in the human condition, the highest priority always wins. So if the highest priority is feeding our ego and the story we have about ourselves in our head, if that's the highest priority, then that will always reshuffle everything else and recast everything else to be how we want to see it. And the reason why I come back to this idea of the neither can live while the other survive is Harry has a very similar kind of childhood to Voldemort, can easily go down that path, has the pain, has the temptation, yet doesn't seem so ambitious and so why. But he tends to, live life from a place of love. And so if you have love, if you're able to love other people, that casts it all out. It's like the water that cools a nuclear power plant, stopping it from blowing up. And it's almost like the narcissism in individual people is when that water, that love, can't come in and cool it, and it eventually it's going to go in a cycle where it explodes. And so that's why I think that powerful prophecy of neither can live while the other survive is that where love is, ego is not. Another way of thinking it, ego is only in the mind. It's the sort of up in the head stuff. Not that that's the only place where the mind is, but ego is up in the mind. And, love is much more of feeling. Another expression that's nice to use sometimes instead of love is deep care for others. And deep care for all others. The true sense of love is caring for everything. The light shines on everything in the room. It can't choose what it shines on. The only thing that it can't shine on is what is blocked from it. And therefore leaving a shadow behind it. And that's, it's just simple. That is the remedy, living from a place of love. I mean, one of the questions I think that rises from this is, is it all bad? Is it all bad? And when we come from a place of ego, is it bad that sometimes things come of it. Sometimes good things come of it. Like I developed my career that way, or I became more prominent or known that way, or I had good times, living from the ego, and I think that's all kind of, you never know what will result from it, but I don't think there's any justification once you're aware for that, because I don't think there's any benefit. Gains that come from the place of narcissism tend to be very short term, just my observation. And they don't seem to last. And you sort of still got to treat the underlying thing. I mean, you look at Voldemort, he does get some power, but ask yourself if you ever find yourself jealous of what Voldemort has, if you're familiar with the Harry Potter stories. He's got power and influence. If that's worth having for its own sake or on any terms, do you envy that journey? And probably no, because he's killing people. But we do, again, temptation. I think we do this all the time, still in the modern modern life and the so-called comfortable societies we live in, progressive societies we live in, there's always temptation to go against who you are because there's some sort of gain that, it pales in comparison to having the good stuff and living from yourself. But we're very happy to bend ourselves into certain shapes and start acting, dressing, speaking a certain way if we're desperate to fit in. People who have got a bedrock of love, normally from parenting maybe, or some sort of other nourishment they got growing up. People who come from a bedrock of love tend to be, in my experience, just the ones least likely. Not that you know everyone's story, just the sense you get from them. That love you have for yourself is the ultimate protection from the world's bullshit. I think it's that simple. And Harry looks like someone who does have love for himself, even as a kid, and Voldemort doesn't. And it's very interesting to then think why. And you think about one of Dumbledore's conditions is that Harry grows up with the Dursleys, who they're not the best to him at all. But there is just enough love there. There's an opportunity, a temptation for Petunia to kick him out, I think in the 5th or the 6th book, 5th book, I think. And she says, no, sorry, he has to stay. And she says it out of fear because Dumbledore sends her the letter. But, it's not the best loving thing, but it's just enough. And even the most twisted, jealous, spiteful people, that there can still be a bit of, as Gilly would say, a scintilla of love in there. Is a very powerful idea. So I just finished this little episode with I don't know. I believe that going from the ego and the place of narcissism is a very ineffective strategy in the long run anyway. It's kind of like saying, why is it so bad if this helps me get further ahead if the small price to pay is my soul? Because that's kind of, to me, the Harry Potter message. It's just that when you read it, you don't identify with becoming a Dark Lord and ruling over muggles. But all temptation is leading us on a path where there's some sort of compromise like that. Anyway, the function of the way the ego is painted so that you can understand it, I think, is the last point, and it's very powerfully done, I think, in Harry Potter. The extreme total corruption of the individual by their narcissism is like the Voldemort character. Can't even understand love. Has no concept for it. Right? Can't understand that Snape loved Lily. He didn't desire her. And because he can't understand that, he can't understand why Snape doesn't remain loyal to him. And that creates a blind spot. He's trying to understand it. He goes to Dumbledore, I've searched high and far and wide, but I've never found, this great magic of love you speak about, he's very condescending to him, that this form of greatness you talk about doesn't exist. So he can only see the world in terms of power. And seeing the world only in that way, what's he left to pursue? Because he doesn't feel good otherwise. And so he's doomed to be pursuing something against himself and against other people. So that's the total corruption. That's what the devil is, and it's what hell is. The image of hell is in Christianity. It's kind of interchangeable for me. I wonder what you think. So that's the total, snake-like, spineless, slithering image, right? And snake again, Garden of Eden. But then another image I think for it is the Chamber of Secrets, and it reminds me very much of the Phantom of the Opera, which is a musical and film, where you got this basilisk creature that lurks in there. It stays dormant for long periods of time, and it can just be activated at random times. But it's always there, but it remains hidden. And that's kind of how the ego lives. You'll talk to people who are very nice, and then you might see a completely different side to them when something happens, or if you've ever seen the show Friends, try and watch the episodes with Ben Stiller in the earlier seasons. He's dating Jennifer Aniston's character Rachel for a bit, and he's a very nice guy, but then when someone sitting in his seat, he just snaps, and it's like a different person takes over, and then he's nice again. And Ross is trying to explain to everyone that he's a nut job, but they don't see it. And that's what ego walking around with. It's so sensitive to certain things, but it learns how to cope and hide itself to survive. in everyday life, so that you're maintaining this exterior that everything's all good, so people can like you and not find you out. But yeah, and the idea of the basilisk, the creature that lurks in there, you can't look it directly in the eye, is very powerful imagery as well, because often these forces are very hard to challenge directly. You can't call someone out for they're insecure. Imagine someone who, say a muscly bodyguard looking like, security guard looking like guy, and saying you work out so much because you're insecure, and you just trigger them. So it's not something you kind of treat directly. I think it's, again, like, it's the only real hope is through showing people the love that's missing inside, which starts with showing ourselves the love that's missing inside. But anyway, they're the two images of the ego. And I think, I don't know if there was much else I wanted to address in this episode, but I'd say the last thing about, the downsides of ego, there's another character, Cormac McLagan. So this is getting real fine Harry Potter knowledge here, but he's not someone you'll easily remember, and probably not from the movies as much anyway, but he tries out for the Quidditch team, and he has more ability than Ron, who Harry actually gives the role to. Ron's more of a team player. So this is more like this is a more digestible version of this lesson than looking at the big Voldemort story. But he ends up filling in for a game as their keeper on the Quidditch team. But he tanks their performance because he can't help but tell people what to do. So even though he's got a bit more ability, his narcissism really actually spoils it, because he can't help telling people what to do. And so he actually abandons his post to go and show someone how to do their job better. So the team starts conceding more goals, and meanwhile he stuffs it up. What he was showing, I think he's showing someone how to be a beater or something. That's Quidditch talk for anyone who's a true Harry Potter nerd like me. He shows them how to do it, and he screws it up. I think he actually hits Harry. So it's the calamity. And that's what narcissism does. You might relate to that in your workplace, someone who's a prick, but they're a high performer. But sometimes the true cost of someone who's a bad narcissist, can't help but interfering with other people, is the flow-on effect. And so there's a short-term momentary gain, but then it comes at a hell of a cost. It kind of always happens on some level. So that's always interesting to look out for. It's fascinating to me, this book. How much did this lady get in here? And any other thoughts? Yeah, I think the last thing is that on the love point, the love, that blind spot Voldemort has, Harry can't survive without the concept of love in this world, because the Malfoys are very important, and Lucius Malfoy and Draco and all that, they end up holding off from giving Voldemort full support by the end. Narcissa Malfoy, doesn't tell Voldemort that Harry's not really dead in the forest, because she's more worried about her son. Her loyalty is to her son. So that the highest priority in a person always wins. The Malfoys actually will have more love for their son than they do for their lust for power and significance. So in the end, that's what kind of wrestles them back into some sort of better spot. I don't know if they're totally absolved. And they end up helping Harry. And of course you got Snape as well. Snape's love for Harry's mum, Lily. That trumps his own, he grew up with a lot of self-hatred, was bullied, all the recipe for toxicity and going for the glory ahead of the good. But love just demands the good of you. You don't have to think about what's good. When comes from a place of love, I guess it doesn't. You just don't have a choice. You're just flooded with the good stuff, and the right thing kind of naturally ensues. So, God, I have so many notes here. Yeah, but it's funny that as great as Voldemort is, that key oversight becomes his undoing. So, I guess that's the thing. So that's the point. I think the next episode we'll do is, the meaning of the mirror of Erised, because I always love that scene. So we'll go to that next. But thanks for checking out the podcast and the Harry Potter series. I'll put some links below for things like the Dormer newsletter, probably, just in case. I don't use that much anymore, but just in case you ever want an update on what's going on, and the constant student. If you're interested in the, I don't know, feel like this is the primary focus for you, exploring, the deeper questions and your deeper curiosities about life. It's the community. We're slowly looking at ramping that back up again. So if you ever, and basically just about meeting people, doesn't cost anything at this point. So if you're ever interested in that, you can check it out. But thank you very much. And remember, the best way to open 1,000 doors for you is to concentrate on opening doors for others.